I'm going to call the City of Groton Special Committee of the Whole meeting for Monday, July 15, 2019 to order. Clerk Patrick, please call the roll.
Present are Mayor Keith Hedrick, Deputy Mayor Jamal Beckford, Councilors Lisa McCabe, Reginald Stanford, Clerk Deborah Patrick. Excused are Councilors Guinevere Depot, Minerva Ortiz, and Rashad Carter,
Okay.
and Finance Director Ryan Best.
Okay. We also have, and I'll let you guys introduce yourselves. Sue, if you could start.
Sue Bergeron, Planning and Zoning.
Bernadette Concamola, Historic District.
Bill Borswick, Beach and Parks. Paul Concamola, Planning and Zoning.
Barbara Foote, ZBA.
Okay. So, just so that everyone knows, this is a Freedom of Information Act training. I wanted to have training for new counselors and for any boards and commission members that wanted to come to this. So we've invited Tom Hennick from the Freedom of Information area out of the state of Connecticut to come and give training. He is the trainer, and some of you may have been through Tom's training before, but it is very informational, and this training will help keep us out of trouble. I'm assuming he'll cover the areas that we've covered before. What is a meeting? What is not a meeting? When to take notes, not to take notes. We'll talk about exemptions and executive session and things like that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tom Hennick. Tom?
Thank you, Mayor. Hello, everybody. How are you tonight? Good? Thank you for inviting me. We really love doing these sessions. We go all over the state to do them, and are particularly pleased when you ask us to come. But it shows that you're interested in doing things the right way, following the law, learning a little bit more. I try to keep my sessions informal, so as we go along, ask questions. You know, you may be going along and I may say something, you say, wait a minute, we don't do it that way. Don't worry, there's no repercussions or anything like that. Let's stop, fix it, so that going forward, you do things the right way. I always tell people a little bit about me, just so that you have an idea. I am not an attorney, and I don't know, is that good news or bad news? How do you feel about that? The reason I share that with you is that I'm not here to give you any binding legal opinions or anything that is an order or a command. The idea, again, is to teach, to give you some of the tools to work with so that freedom of information is something that becomes sort of second nature. It's not something you have to worry about. You do what you need to do the work that you're either elected or assigned to do on the different boards and commissions that you're on, and not have to worry about FOI. Now, I will tell you this. You've got some folks who are knowledgeable that you can lean on. Your mayor, Deb, has been doing this for a while, and Jill knows a lot about it as well. But also feel free to call us anytime. We want you to call us when you have questions, when you have issues. You'll probably get me, so now you have a face to put with the voice on the other end of the phone. I'm on the phone a lot, so you may get voicemail, but you will attest that I will call you back. You will get a call back, and I'll give you an answer. It may not be the answer you want, but it's something that you can work with to go forward. When we talk about freedom of information, we sort of have to give a little bit of history. This is the law in the state of Connecticut. This is something that is required of every public agency in Connecticut. It's 44 years old. It was Ella Grasso's brainchild when she ran for governor for the first time. And if you do the math, 44 years ago puts us right smack in the middle of Watergate. You had a country that was in turmoil, a country that was concerned that government was being conducted in secret, behind closed doors. And when Watergate kind of exploded, Ella was contemplating this run for governor. She hadn't run yet, and she was in Congress. She was in Congress representing her district, and she said, you know, if I get elected governor, if I do this, one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to create an open government law. And as you know, she ran and she won, and that literally is one of the first things she did in 1975. And she did something else that's kind of interesting, and if you're at all into politics, she sort of stood up and said, this is really important stuff, folks, and I will see to it that this law is approved unanimously by our legislature. Have you ever watched the legislature, right? Can you imagine guaranteeing a unanimous vote on this or on anything? Well, she guaranteed it, and I'm here to tell you she got it. I've seen a video. There was not a single no vote in the House, not a single no vote in the Senate. This law passed into being unanimously. Now, other than being interesting, it shows you, first of all, how important it was then, how important it remains today. Government works best in the sunlight, transparent government. But also it gives us a little insight as to why we have to do these sessions. Because to get to that point where everybody was voting yes, can you imagine the conversations behind closed doors? Can you imagine the arm twisting? Well, I like this and I don't like that. So you have a law that's based on a pretty simple, easy concept. Do your business in public. But if you try to read it, has anybody tried to read it? Even a paragraph or two, right? Sometimes your eyes roll to the back of your head. You know, it's like, what do they mean? My intuition says this, well, that's because to get there, that everybody was voting yes, there had to be compromise. And they left some things open so that it's not black and white, so that it's open to interpretation. And surprise, guess who has to do that? Those of you who are on the front lines. Gee, should it be an executive session? I don't know. When is the meeting notice due? You know, Deb, help us out with that. You know, so those sort of things, you have to make these decisions, and you're going to make it based on your best information, based on what you think is the right thing to do. And there may be somebody on the other side of the issue who disagrees. Because it's subject to interpretation, another thing this law did was create the Freedom of Information Commission, which is where I work. And if people believe they've been denied what this law gives them the right to have, the access they've been denied, they file a complaint with the FOI Commission. And the commission ultimately is the judge of whether or not you've done the right thing. The city of Groton has a meeting, goes into executive session, someone says that wasn't right. They shouldn't have done that. They file a complaint with the FOI Commission. Both sides go to the commission and make their case, and the commission says, no, city, you were correct, not a problem, or you were wrong, don't do it again. That becomes, you know, the decision, that becomes what you should do going forward. And even the FOI Commission is subject to the same interpretations. If you don't like the decision that the commission makes, you can appeal it. You can take it all the way to the state Supreme Court. So it requires some thought. It requires you to have the tools to work with so that you operate in a proper fashion. And it requires you to just move forward thinking, okay, we're going to do our work in public. I told you that it's 44 years old, and it is called Freedom of Information. It's really, however, about two things. It's about access to public meetings and access to public records. Now, for you all tonight, I'm going to focus more on the meetings provisions. I'll give you a little bit about records, because typically records requests wind up being handled by staff. They don't usually go through boards, volunteer boards and commissions. But I will also just sort of share another thing with you. I told you I wasn't an attorney. A lot of times when I do these sessions, especially the evening sessions, people are, you're all volunteers, right? So when you go to the local restaurants, they give you a big hug and they say, thanks for all you're doing for our town and our city, right? Free food, free drinks, right? Right, am I right? People say, Tom, you don't get it. You don't understand. We're volunteers. We didn't sign up for this FOI stuff. Well, just for the record, I do understand. I was on a board in my town for 10 years. I was the chairman for the last 5. I get it. You're doing something else during the day, and then it's basically like a second full-time job sometimes, isn't it? Especially during a busy season. And for some reason, when I was asked to fill out a term on another board, because the person left town for health reasons, and so I'm back on another board right now. So I do get it. I really do truly understand what it's like. There's a temptation to say, well, gee, that's not how we do it at the bank, or that's not how we do it at the insurance. You have to remember it's a public agency by definition, and that's how you have to move going forward. So access to meetings and access to records, one of the first things I always tell people is, it says freedom of information, but that just kind of sounds better. You know, it's not really about free information. I don't know if you've had this happen, but a lot of times people say, hey, under this freedom of information thing, you got to give me some answers. I don't know, you have people come and ask you questions, why this, why that, and it's not really about answering questions. It's about coming to the meetings and watching you all do your work, or it's getting the records where the information is contained and learning for yourself. But you're not really the answer people, although, listen, we're public servants, we're going to answer questions when asked, if possible, but at some point you're allowed to say, look, I'm not comfortable answering that, I'm not sure of the answer for that, I'll come to the meeting and listen to how it goes. A lot of times when I do these sessions, people say, you know, you should really sort of stop the freedom of information stuff. You should really maybe put together an hour of stand-up to show people, you know, because think about working at the Freedom of Information Commission. People think we're the information center for the entire state of Connecticut. They call us up with all kinds of questions, thinking that all we have to do is snap our fingers and out comes the answer. Now, it's about access to records. They think that we sit in this giant vault with every record held by every agency in the state of Connecticut. And all I have to do is push a button and send it out. I take calls like that and emails like that daily. I took a call Just to give you an example, a couple weeks ago from a gentleman, he says, "Can you get me a copy of my naturalization papers?" I said, "Isn't that kind of like a federal thing, you know?" He says, "Yeah, it is. I went to them, they were going to charge me $500. I thought maybe you had an extra copy lying around." No, the FOI Commission is not a repository for records. That's not what we do. So we have to explain to people what the law is about, and you may have that happen to you. I don't know, a full house at a meeting, they may come in and say, "I have a right to know. Tell me, how did you make that decision? Why is that budget number what it's supposed to be?" And again, you do the best you can, but at some point, this law doesn't require you to do that. So, access to meetings and access to records. When we talk about meetings, here's the definition. Meeting means any hearing or other proceeding of a public agency. Any convening or assembly of a quorum of a multi-member public agency. And any communication by or to a quorum of a multi-member public agency, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment, to discuss or act upon a matter over which the public agency has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. Here's the bottom line. Anytime you gather to do your work in any way, shape, or form, consider it a meeting. And make sure you've properly noticed it, make sure it's open to the public, and make sure there are minutes when the meeting is done. All too often, I'll get something like this. They'll say, "Tom, we just got together informally. You know, we went out for dinner and we were just chatting, and we took care of a couple of things." Don't do it. If it's not noticed, that's a meeting, and I guarantee you, when you do that, the wrong person's sitting in the next booth. I guarantee it never fails. Well, we're going to form a little subcommittee. The subcommittee's not the full board. That way, we don't have to worry about freedom of information. And whenever I hear that, I get very nervous, because if you're not worrying about it, you're setting yourself up for a real problem. An FOI fire is what I call it. Subcommittees are public agencies too, as defined by the law. I didn't read you the definition of a public agency, which is what this law applies to, but there's a phrase in there that says, "including any committee of or created by." So even if you create a committee of two, it becomes a public agency in and of itself and needs to follow the same rules. A lot of times people say, "Well, we didn't have a quorum, so we're not going to worry about it." Again, that one's not necessarily true either. Now, that one's a little trickier in that there is an appellate court ruling in Connecticut that says no quorum, no meeting. There's also an appellate court ruling in Connecticut that says no quorum, you're still having a meeting. Can't make it up. Think about it. The appellate court, next to the Supreme Court, the highest court in the state, basically tells us the opposite thing. So when people call up and ask about the quorum issue, I have to tell them there are situations where even absent a quorum, it could be a meeting if you're conducting board business. So don't automatically assume no quorum, no meeting. Now, you might say, well, why doesn't somebody decide that? The court actually went to the case went to the Supreme Court a few years ago, and they gave oral arguments to try to come up with a solution. The Supreme Court heard those oral arguments and then said, "You know what? The fancy words. We have improvidently taken up this matter. You guys figure it out." And let both rulings stand. So when people call and ask that question, the honest answer is, it could still be a meeting. The most current, most recent case involves the city of Meriden. They sat in a room like this, and they called themselves the executive committee of their council. And they were doing something really important. They were putting together a committee to look for a new town manager. The reporter walked in the room. And by the way, this is something I would advise you against if a reporter walks in the room. They said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "Well, this looks like a meeting." He said, "No, it's not. Get out." Well, that immediately, I paraphrased, but that was it. That's what happened. So he's saying, well, what were they doing? So he investigates a little bit, finds out what they were doing, and files a complaint with the FOI Commission. And their only rationale for not noticing that and doing it in public was that it wasn't a quorum. They're just rock solid sure, no quorum, we don't have to worry about FOI. Well, surprise, the complaint goes to the commission, and the commission says, no, that was a meeting, because even though there was no quorum, you were doing something really important, and the public had a right to know. They appealed that, and the Superior Court has upheld the FOI Commission decision, saying no quorum, no meeting. In that instance, that was a meeting. They then took it to the appellate court. They obviously didn't like the ruling, and arguments have been made before the appellate court, so maybe now we'll get an answer one way or another. But as we sit here today, even absent a quorum, it could be a meeting. That's the message on that, okay? There are three kinds of meetings outlined in the FOI Act. There's a regular meeting, there's a special meeting, which is what this is, and there is an emergency meeting. Regular meeting is a meeting that you have per a schedule that you submit to your town clerk by the end of January of every year. I suspect you've all been through that. You've done it, when are we going to meet, first and third Tuesday, second and fourth Wednesday, 7 o'clock council chamber, whatever that is, that's when you're scheduled to meet. Special meeting is a meeting that happens when you're not scheduled to meet. Now, a lot of people see that word special and they get all worked up and they say, oh, look, we can only do this, only do that. You can do anything you want to do at a special meeting. Here's the difference. For both of those, you have to prepare an agenda. And I don't know if any of you are involved in that. If you are agenda preparers, make sure that you are as specific as possible. Make sure that your agenda has as much on there so that the public can pick it up and say, okay, I know what I'm supposed to do. At a regular meeting, which follows this tonight, you can talk about anything, and if it's not on the agenda, you can make a motion and add it to the agenda by a 2/3 vote of those board members who are present. So something comes up and the chairman says, is there any other business? Yes, this isn't on the agenda, I'd like to talk about it. But at a special meeting, you can't talk about anything that's not on that agenda. So if something is on a special meeting agenda, you can do anything you need, but if it's not on there, you can't add to the agenda. So when you prepare an agenda for a special meeting, items like other business, old business, new business are pointless unless there's something underneath it. At a regular meeting, you can say, is there any other business, and add it, but at the special meeting, you can't. So they're basically the same, except for that one contingency there. The third kind of meeting, the emergency meeting. Folks, that's a meeting that I would really discourage you not to use. Emergency meeting is an unnoticed meeting, and the law really wants as much to be done in public as possible. One of the problems is that what you and I think might be an emergency doesn't necessarily rise to that level in the eyes of the law. You know, we have these sort of non-legal ideas as to what an emergency is, and the law sets that bar really high. It doesn't want you to meet without notice. I'm in my 19th year at the FOI Commission. I can tell you this in all honesty, this has happened every single one of those 19 years. On the Tuesday, for some reason, after Martin Luther King's birthday, maybe it's because it's close to some of the other holidays, the phone will ring on that Tuesday morning and it goes something like this: Tom, I've got a problem. What's the problem? Our regular meeting is tonight, Tuesday night. I always put our agenda in on Monday without fail. I forgot we were closed yesterday. So I put it in this morning. Is that okay? Well, if you do the math, it's not 24 hours. It's not okay. So I say, you would best be advised to have the meeting 24 hours later. No, we've got way too much to do. I don't know if we can get everybody together. We'll have it tonight. It's an emergency. We've got too much to do. Now, in our minds, in our non-legal minds, it feels like an emergency, but the law doesn't look at it that way. My advice to them is to always, be smart and wait 24 hours. And people say, well, what's the big deal? What's going to happen? I have one sort of large example as to why you maybe want to be thinking twice about doing this. It happened over in Ridgefield, the other side of the state. A few years back, the assistant fire chief, I guess, thought he was going to be the next chief. The chief was retiring or moving to another town or something like that. Very excited. And then the rumor, and he's walking around town, he's very excited. And then he finds out that the rumor is false. He ain't going to be the next chief. Then he gets really angry. He storms into the first selectman's office one afternoon. It's a Friday afternoon, and they start screaming and yelling. And how could you do this to me? This is terrible. This is awful. Things getting, swept off desks. Awful. First selectman's known this guy for years. Calms him down. He says, "Look, you're not going to be the next chief, but I tell you what, we'll make you the interim chief while we look for a new chief, and that's the best I can do." Well, the guy's not happy. He leaves. Well, you can imagine, you're a small town. I live in a small town. It doesn't take very long for word about that, blow up to get out. And the texts start flying in and the emails and the phone starts ringing. This is terrible. This is horrible. He threatened you. He was a danger to you. We got to do something about this. So the first selectman thinks about it and he says, well, maybe so. So he decides he's going to have an emergency meeting the next morning, Saturday morning. He brings in his board. He says, what do you guys think about this? And they had all heard about it. And he says, you know what? He's no good. Let's get rid of him. Okay, good. All in favor, but they fire him. They fire him on the spot Saturday morning. So now they got to tell him, they got to find him. So he's not in his office, he's somewhere. It turns out he was like on his roof cleaning his gutters or something like that. So they come on down, bring him down. He's got the leaves hanging out of his hair, the ripped sweatshirt, the whole thing. They bring him down to town hall. Thanks for coming in, you're fired. He explodes all over again. You blankety blanks can't fire me. This is terrible. This is horrible. Screaming and yelling, he storms out. Besides, as he's walking out the door, you can't fire me because I quit. So they reconvene the emergency meeting and accept his resignation. So he thinks about it for a little bit. He says, wait a minute, what was the emergency? Why couldn't they have noticed this thing, had it, Monday even, so that at least people could know what's going on? I could defend myself. So he files a complaint with the FOI Commission. And the commission hears all the testimony evidence and says, you know what? There was no emergency there. And they find in favor of the fire chief, or former assistant fire chief, and they invoke one of the strongest powers that the commission has, which is to declare null and void everything that happened at that meeting. So basically, he now was fired and or quit at a meeting that didn't happen. Not the end of the story, because Ridgefield didn't like that decision and appealed it all the way to the state Supreme Court. Ultimately, the state Supreme Court upheld the commission's decision and said, we too declare null and void what happened at that meeting. Now, if you're familiar at all with the court process, it wasn't 5 days later. It was more like 5 years later. So think about it. This happens here, 5 or 6 years later. Oh, I heard somebody say it. How much back pay do they owe? Right?
Exactly.
And there are situations with his health care. And if he had been retired or moved on, he would have one thing, but because he was fired, he didn't get it, and it was a mess. And so I tell people that story, and they said, well, so it's all settled now, right? It actually took 2 years after the court decision, so it's almost like 7 or 8 years after they had that meeting, they were still fighting. Think of the legal fees. Think of the tension in town, the agita. I mean, oh my goodness, all because they didn't wait 24 hours. So is that going to happen every time you mess up a meeting? No. But if you're thinking that, it's no big deal. Let's suppose you have a budget vote, and you set your budget, and someone decides that they don't like it, and you've done it wrong. You haven't noticed it properly or something like that. If it looks like you've intentionally helped people out, I mean, that's a worst case scenario. So always think twice before you try to do something without sort of general notice to the public. People say, well, what's a real emergency? It's kind of hard to pin down. Basically, it's keeping people safe. I was down in Stonington back in April, and you all probably heard about this, that during one of those horrible rainstorms, it seems like there was one every other day, there was a factory building that sat on a body of water, and it started crumbling into the water. They needed to meet then. They couldn't wait 24 hours. They needed to meet on the spot to get fire and police in place to block off roads and do things like that to keep people out of harm's way. That's an emergency. And if you have a situation like that, if you ever do, I hope you never do, you meet, you do what you have to do, and within 72 hours you create minutes that reflect what the emergency was, who was there, and what you did about it. But again, the best option is to wait 24 hours if you have any questions or any doubt at all what you should do. The law says make sure your meetings are open to the public. So if somebody wanders in here tonight, you don't say, oh, wait a minute, you're from Groton town, not from Groton City. Get out. You can't do that. Anybody can come in. Anybody can audio or videotape a meeting. Now that is less of an issue today because we're on a lot. So many of you record your meetings, but still, I have some boards who are camera shy. They want people to turn them off. And the other thing that I don't really love about that provision is that they don't have to tell you. Let's face it, we're all videographers today. We pull our phones out, we can record. So if you're at a table at a meeting, my advice is always to say, you know what, somebody could be recording this. Common decency would tell me, please, tell me that you're recording, but people just don't. They just don't. So always think that maybe you're on candid camera, as it were. One thing this law doesn't do is guarantee anybody the right to speak at a public meeting. And a lot of people think that it does. They come to meetings and they say, I'm going to that meeting because I want to give them a piece of my mind. Well, that's all well and good, but if you decide they're not going to, they don't have the right to demand to speak at a meeting. So if you have a situation where the room is packed and everybody has a lot to say, and you say, you know what, we'll never get through this tonight, 2-minute limit, perfectly okay. Or we've talked this issue to death the last month, we're not going to talk about it again. I mean, there are ramifications politically, in town and stuff like that, but that's up to you. You get to make those choices. how you control public speaking, who speaks, when they speak, is really entirely in your hands. And some people are really shocked when they call up and they say, I went to the damn meeting last night and they wouldn't let me speak, blah, blah, blah. You know, it's not an FOI violation. There may be other things at play. You may have something in a charter or in bylaws that say, you know, you have public comment, but you're not violating FOI if you shut down or limit public speaking in any way. So we're talking about making sure that your boards and your commissions are operating in public so that people can come and watch. There are obviously a couple paths that you can take to exclude the public. I assume you're all veterans or you've been around long enough to know that there's something called an executive session. The executive session, folks, is a portion of a publicly noticed open meeting. It's not a separate thing. It's not, something you do on the side. You still need to notice. Let's suppose you've got a meeting and the only item is an executive session item. You still notice it. You still put in your notice at least 24 hours in advance. Your agenda says executive session for the purpose of, and you outline what that is, and I'll get to that in a second. You convene, call the meeting to order, somebody makes the motion, you vote to go into that executive session. You discuss that item for as long as you want. You can stay in that session as long as you want, but never, ever, ever, ever take action behind closed doors. Always come out of that executive session to vote. So you're in executive session, you have your conversation, you come out, you vote, and the meeting's adjourned. The vote obviously needs to be recorded. Every vote that you take needs to be recorded in the minutes, needs to reflect who votes for what or for whom. So the 5 specific reasons for an executive session: a personnel matter, pending claims, pending litigation, a security matter, a land transaction. You are on a school building committee. You're adding on to an elementary school, or you're building a new middle school or something like that, and you're negotiating with property owners as to, different parcels of land, how much you're going to pay. You're reviewing, sight lines and traffic studies and things like, and all of that. You could do a lot of that behind closed doors because you wouldn't want everybody to know what kind of dollars you were throwing around. You're trying to get the best deal for the town, so you can have those kinds of negotiations behind closed doors. The 5th reason for an executive session is a little broader. It's something of a catch-all. It allows a board or commission to have a conversation about a document or documents that it believes are exempt from disclosure. Any of you on boards that deal with bids or RFPs, there's an exemption in the FOI Act that says you're allowed to withhold the contents of a bid package or RFP. So let's suppose you are a Board of Education and you put your transportation contract out to bid, and all the different bus companies, the DATCO, First Student, Durham Services, I don't know who operates down here, but you get the idea. They all put in bid packages, and the board wants to review them before it makes a decision. Because it hasn't released the content of those packages, they're exempt. It's a temporal exemption until the contract is signed. Take them into executive session, study them, go over them, rip them apart, put whatever, and then come out to vote. You could do that. Let's suppose you ask your attorney for a written legal opinion. You are the client. The written legal opinion is covered by the attorney-client privilege. So you're able to take that written opinion as the client and go into executive session to talk about that written advice that your attorney has given you. That's something you could do in executive session. That's just a couple examples. But if you've got, an exempt document that the board needs to talk about, that's a vehicle to do it. I want to back up to the first 3 that I talked about. The executive session for personnel. First of all, when you put together an agenda or a motion, do not just say executive session personnel or personnel matter. The courts have come down very hard on boards and commissions for going that route. You have to say more. Executive session, discussion of a park and rec employee, discussion of a police officer, discussion of a teacher. You don't necessarily have to name the individual, but the law is very clear. You have to have more than just personnel. And the balance is something you can create. If you're a police commission, and you're going to talk about the chief, well, there's only one of them, so you might as well put the name, you know what I mean? But if it's multiple employees, discussion of the performance of a public works employee, something like that, you could do that. You want to make sure that if you're talking about an individual, that he or she is given notice in advance. You must tell the person in advance that you're going to talk about them in executive session. They then have the right to come forward and say, no, no, wait a minute. No executive session. I want that done in public. I want that done in the open so that everybody can hear it. And if that happens and the person sticks to that, you cannot go into executive session. That is the individual's right. What the individual does not have the right to do, and many people think that they do, is to demand to enter the executive session with you. So in other words, you're talking about me, you're going into executive session, I demand to go in the room with you. The person does not have that right. The person only has the right to demand an open discussion. So if they waive that right to the open discussion, and you want to go into executive session, it's your call. It becomes the board's call whether or not the individual is invited in. Now, many, many times, you invite the person in to have a discussion, but you're never obligated to do that. A board is allowed to invite in whomever it wants, to give evidence, to give testimony, to have a conversation, to find out things, but it's never required to bring anybody in. The only people who have a legal right immediately to be in the executive session are members of the board. Okay? The executive session for pending claims and pending litigation is pretty much what it sounds like. It's a conversation about a lawsuit. You've been sued. You've been, there's a grievance. There's an FOI complaint. You want to talk about your strategy. You have a right to do that behind closed doors. It's a little broader in that it allows a board or commission to have a conversation about taking legal action. I heard somebody say they're from ZBA. Let's suppose you deny a variance to somebody, and they, it's to put a pool in, and they put the damn thing in anyway, and you want to, show them that you mean business. Well, you would talk about how you're going to take action against them behind closed doors. You wouldn't have to tip them off at a public meeting, going into executive session to talk about protecting the city's legal rights. You could do that. The last one, the executive session for a security matter, frankly, that's one that never used to come up. And then Sandy Hook happened in 2012. And sadly, it's come up a lot since then, mostly with boards of education, talking about adding extra resource officers, talking about new alarm systems, security, things like that. And on the off chance that the wrong person was sitting in the audience, the person you're trying to keep out of that school building, you could have that conversation behind closed doors. Again, I stress to you, remember, never vote behind closed doors. Always come out, make sure all your action is public, and make sure that you've done everything so that people know who voted for what or for whom.
Can I get a point of
Yeah.
clarification on that? Because I've done this before, I want to make sure that I'm okay. The actual documented vote is done outside.
Correct.
I don't have a problem with that.
Right.
My question is, when I'm in executive session, can I get a consensus to see if I want to continue discussion further? Because if I'm split, and it's going to be a no vote in the end because I don't either meet my 50% plus one or my 2/3, then we may continue discussion, kind of like jury deliberation. And I want to make sure that I'm not in violation of something. Am I trying to?
I hear, no.
Okay.
What I would suggest is you don't say, do we have a consensus? I would say something like, are we done here? Because
Okay.
technically, I'm being technical now.
Yeah,
The technical answer would be when you ask for a consensus, you're taking a vote.
okay,
So you just say, look, guys, are we done? And you as the chair would have to kind of read the room and decide whether you needed to come out or not.
okay.
All right? A lot of time, people use executive session. I dealt with somebody about a month or so ago. They said, well, we went into executive session. We weren't really sure. We wanted to explain something to everybody because if we talked about it in public, they might look stupid. I mean, you want to make sure that you go in for a legitimate reason because that one wound up being the target of a complaint. There was no legitimate reason for going into executive session. And, they probably should have just done it in public and whatever happens, happens. Are there any other questions about executive session? Any thoughts? Okay, so that's path one for excluding the public. The second one is one of those things that kind of leaves us all banging our heads against the wall. I read you the definition of a meeting. The sentence that follows that goes like this: meeting does not include. And there follows a list of things many of which everybody at this table would call a meeting. And the legislature said, that's fine, you can call it a meeting if you like, but it's not a meeting for the purposes of freedom of information. It makes it very difficult to try to explain what the hell is going on. In that list of things, for instance, collective bargaining. Do we have unions in the city of Groton?
Well, they,
Okay. Collective bargaining strategy sessions, not meetings. Negotiating sessions, not meetings. Now, I don't know how you do it, but when I was on that Board of Education, at times, we all sat in on those negotiations, and you're thinking, wait a minute, the whole board's in the room, or even just the finance committee's in the room, and they're doing something that's probably as important as anything they do, at least fiscally, right? The teacher's budget is, teacher's contract, a huge portion of our budget, yet nobody knew what was going on. Because for the purposes of freedom of information, the law says that's not a meeting. Executive level search committees. You have some executive level positions, people retire, people move on. You want to put somebody in that position. Now, that one kind of makes sense to me because you're looking for the best possible candidates. And under that scenario, you'd probably get applications from people who already have jobs and don't want their current employers to know that they're looking. So that one makes sense. But an executive level search committee, I mentioned that Meriden situation. Well, the city manager's an important position there. So they put together that committee. Once they put the committee together, that committee can operate outside of freedom of information, which means it's not noticed, it's not open, there are no minutes, and they can come up with the best candidates and bring them forward. Social gatherings. You all like each other, right? You're gonna go out to dinner maybe, out to lunch? You can do that, but the wording, I sort of get a chuckle out of it. Neither planned nor intended for the purpose of discussing matters relating to official business. I sort of chuckle, well, what else are you gonna talk about, right? Here's what we have to remember, folks. We don't want to be naive, but we want to be careful. You go out to lunch, you go out to dinner, you go to a party, you're probably going to talk about some board stuff, but stop short of those deep, deliberative conversations that you should be having here at the table. What did I miss at the last meeting? You said you got a couple people on vacation or coming back. You can have that conversation. Discussion about things on the agenda, what's going to be on the agenda, those are all fine. I want this, I want that. But you made that statement at the last meeting, I thought that was unfair, and here's why. And well, you don't want to do that. You want to have those discussions here at the table. You want to avoid those discussions offline. One of the lines that I like to use is don't set your budget over the eggnog at the Christmas party, Be smart about when you have those discussions. Let's face it, where do the best meetings in this city take place? In that parking lot after the meeting, am I right? Am I right? You want to rehash and stuff like that? Well, again, be smart about it. You want to have a short discussion, you're probably okay, but, I told you I was the chairman of this board, so the chairman usually is the last one to leave. People come up, they want to ask questions, turn off the lights. I go out in the parking lot, and my guys are in little groups talking. I said, what are you doing? What are you doing? I'm the FOI guy. Get. Because they were, we did that. I don't think we should have done that. Well, you can't. You want to be really smart about that. The conversations are going to happen. Just be really careful the extent, the depth to which you have them. Don't dig too deep in some of those conversations. And to that end, I don't know if you remember the definition. I read it when I started talking. Whether in person or by means of electronic equipment. Electronic equipment was written 44 years ago. The chairman gets on the phone and says, I want your vote on this, you need to do this, I want you to do this, bing, bang, boom. You walk in, the house is packed, everybody's ready for a big debate. All in favor, up shoot the hands. All in favor. What happened? What happened is they had the meeting on the phone before it took place, and you can't do that. And in 2019, we're talking about a lot more than telephones. We're talking about emails and texts and Twitter and Facebook and all those things. I'm not telling you not to use them, but again, those kind of conversations are almost a double jeopardy. You start emailing each other about something and back and forth, and you're having a passionate debate via email. First of all, that's improper. Second of all, somebody can say, I want to see any and all emails between the mayor and the deputy mayor about this issue, and all of a sudden you've had a meeting that you shouldn't have. Avoid the deep deliberative conversations that you should have at the table, be it email or text or anything like that. Being mindful of the fact that anybody can say, hey, I want to see those emails, and you just be really smart about that, okay? Are there any questions about that? About the word that Deb's probably heard this, that people sort of slap on some of those things are the non-meeting. And that's enough to make me scream. That's nowhere in the law, but think about it. You sit at one of those bargaining sessions, do you all have to have a hand in that? You have the different bargaining sessions?
No, I have my attorney and my HR.
Okay, well, on my board, we were all there, novices, but nonetheless, we're looking across the table from the teachers that we're counting on to carry the bacon, as it were, and we're negotiating all night long, and then you go home and where were you, dear? I was at a non-meeting. You're in all night, but that's what they've done. They've taken them outside of FOIs.
Going back, when someone makes a request to see all these emails and stuff, who produces that information?
The request goes to the person who has them. And if they're on a town server or something like that, then they go through the IT person. But if they're on yours, something to remember is, it doesn't matter where you create those emails. Oh, I was at home, so they're off limits. No, they're not. Anything you create in the conduct of city business becomes a public record by definition. Now, there are different exemptions and things like that that might pull them off the table, but the request goes to you, and you would have to produce them.
And my suggestion to people is, just don't do it. Don't do it on your own personal email. We do have city emails. Don't do it on your text. Don't do it on your phone. Don't do it over your personal emails, because even though you say, well, I don't care if somebody looks, somebody's got to go through all your documents.
Right.
That means if it's on your phone, they're going through everything in your phone. Somebody.
In theory, it would be you, that you would go through it. You wouldn't have to turn it over. But share a little story with you to sort of back that point up. Up in Putnam, the mayor entered a pumpkin in the largest pumpkin growing contest. That's what we rural folks do. And he won. He was very excited. He's got a picture of the pumpkin on his phone. And he walks around town hall and he's showing it to everybody. And he gets to his administrative assistant, and they don't get along real well. She's a holdover from the last administration, and he says, well, what the heck. So he shows her the picture of the pumpkin. So she's got the phone in her hand, and she scrolls. It's a true story. The first thing she scrolls is an email exchange between this mayor and other members of the council that basically call this woman a tramp. That say she's in her job because she slept her way to the top and blah, 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 blah. Well, she is rightfully outraged, and now she's seen it, and so she's demanding to see all these things. And what's his first response? You can't have it because it's my phone. Well, it happened to be his town-owned phone, so he wasn't going anywhere with it. But even if it had been his personal phone, this conversation was intertwined with town business. Let's do this tomorrow. Can you meet me here for that? And boom, that's all public. They tried like the devil to not have it released, but ultimately, even the attorney who knew, he knows the law well enough, he knew that he was going to lose, so he had to try to defend it. They had to extract those and turn them out. The emails were public records. So, be smart about the extent you use your personal devices to do public work. The last thing we should talk about with meetings is minutes. Does anybody in the room have that task, doing minutes? Poor unfortunate soul, right? I feel your pain, Deb. I don't know if we've ever talked about this, but I do the FOI commission meeting minutes. I get it. Here's my advice. Minutes need not be the recreation of War and Peace. They are not every word that everybody says, although there are some that would like it. I'm dealing with a situation now over in Shelton. They've got a woman who is dogging them about not having their minutes done on time, and she's right. Minutes need to be available to the public in 7 days, period. Well, they require so much information of her in the minutes. First of all, they're cycling through secretaries like you and I take a drink of water, and second of all, they're mammoth. They're page upon page upon. They can't get done in time, and so there's a real problem there. And I'm going to try to go over there and talk to them and say, look, you got to cut them down. You don't need verbatim transcripts, especially since you're probably recording the damn thing anyway, right? When you make your minutes too long, here's what happens. Well, I didn't say that, or I didn't mean to say that, or could we take that out? I sound kind of stupid. Maybe we should take that out, right? I have, when boards expand them to that point, I've had so many conversations about that. Minutes need to be a crisp, clear, concise recapitulation of what happened at the meeting. Technically, the only thing required is a record of the votes. You want more than that. You're creating the historical record for your city, but how much more is in your hands? Not the person in the audience who's making a big speech, or even, with all due respect, a board member who makes a big speech. You know, you want to keep it short, tight, and concise. I have an example. Let's see if I can find it quickly. So we had a situation. I did one of these over in Waterford well, it's about a year ago now. And we talked about this. We talked about minutes. And shortly after I did the workshop, the chairman of the Waterford East Lyme Shellfish Commission checks in and says, look, I got a question about minutes. We tend to go verbatim when people speak from the audience and we put this in here. And so this is what they had about this guy. He said he requested a copy of the 15-month study noted in the DEEP public hearing notice that's sent out to area homeowners, stated the areas of Keeney Cove and Golden Spur waters are polluted, is against granting a project for NBSF when NBSF already has one in East Lyme's Niantic Bay. Okay, so that's fine, except that then this guy sends them a note, this was wrong, that was wrong, I didn't mean that, I didn't say that, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So the question from the chairman is this: I know minutes are not verbatim. How would you suggest we handle this going forward? Could we be more general in how we record public comment? Mr. Wise commented on the NBSF aquaculture project. Yes, you've captured it. You don't mince words. You don't have him. So anyway, that's just the one bit of advice on minutes. You obviously are going to do what you need to do and try to condense them, try to keep them tight.
Well, we've done that before. We've said, you know, so-and-so spoke in opposition to or in favor of or support of. I mean, Deb tends to have a little more detail because I think that's important. But I don't think you go overboard
I don't think
with
so.
the level of detail.
No.
that you-
Unless it's a really contentious subject, and then I want to just add a little more just to give it, so someone who wasn't there would really understand
Right.
the way that the conversation went.
Have you looked at any of those minutes when I was the clerk? When we used paper like this, and she made me say everything that everyone said.
But
Yeah, we-
you
we've
were
gone
well
away-
within your rights to say no.
Well,
Oh,
and,
right?
I thought the mayor was the boss.
well, we've gone away, that philosophy, we've, over the years, this is not just me, but over the years, we have gone more of a philosophy of generalization as opposed to the exact, because you're not a stenographer, and it's not meant to be exact detail of every word that's captured.
Yeah,
And it's-
and it was so much. What size do you call that?
You did,
12 by 8.
you did the legal size.
Legal, yeah.
Oh, boy. And when you,
I brought it down to the.
yeah,
Yeah, and, I mean, just as you say, every word everyone said about anybody or anything,
not good.
I had to put in there. And when I look at, you know, your minutes, I go, oh, so lucky she got the point across.
Right.
And I-
But see, that's something that whoever was chairing that board didn't hear what I just, was.
Yeah, well, that was the mayor. She,
Barbara was the clerk just before me.
I feel your pain.
she beat me.
So, let me spend just a couple
back to
minutes
this.
to talk to you. Well, first of all, are there any questions about things relating to meetings that I didn't touch on, that you wanted to ask me about?
Quick one, we're talking about going into an executive
Yeah.
session, we'll go back a little bit. And we talked about personnel,
Right.
and in this case, it was an investigation. Do we need to invite that person into these sessions?
If
Under
it's
the
a person, if it's a
investigation?
personnel matter, no. They have to be informed, they could have it done in public, which I suspect they wouldn't want,
Right,
but you're not obligated to bring them in under FOI.
got it, okay,
Right.
we're good.
So let me just spend a couple of minutes that we have left before your meeting. The mayor was gracious. He said that I could go as long as I want, but you all need to know that my wife and daughter are chowing down at Abbott's, so I have to get over there and get them out of there before I go broke, so, all right? But public records. I told you it's about access to meetings and access to records. When we talk about public records, just listen to the words of the definition. Public records or files means any recorded data or information relating to the conduct of the public's business, prepared, owned, used, received, or retained by a public agency, or to which a public agency is entitled to receive a copy by law or contract, whether such data or information be handwritten, typed, tape recorded, printed, photostated, photographed, or recorded by any other method. And then we flip over to this, which says, except as otherwise provided by any federal law or state statute, all records maintained or kept on file by any public agency, whether or not such records are required by any law or by any rule or regulation, shall be public records. And every person shall have the right to inspect such records promptly during regular office or business hours, copy such records in accordance with subsection G of 1-212, or receive a copy of such records in accordance with 1-212. The bottom line is, and I just sort of hear this for a second, that everything that you create in the conduct of city business is defined on the surface as a public record. And then we talk about things that may be exempt, that it's an invasion of somebody's privacy in a personnel file, you don't give it out. It's a school record that has student educational records, you don't give it out. But all too often, people who do what we do just immediately say, no, you can't have it. Say, it's my record, it's city council record, you can't have it. It's ZBA record, you can't have it. It's P&Z record, you can't have it. Or worse than that, we get selective. You look like a very nice person, you can have the records. You look very suspicious, you get nothing. And you used to be a reporter, so out, you get nothing. You would think that after 44 years that didn't happen. But we all have difficult people that we have to deal with. You need to put blinders on. You need to put blinders on and say, look at what the content of the record is, not what they want to do with it, if it's a record that's not exempt, you give it out. I'm going to share, at the risk of running up against the time, this is one story, you want to hear this. Now this involves the city of Hartford. And the person making the request makes a lot of requests for Hartford. He has for a long time. And in this particular instance, I should also say he's kind of like a journalist. He does a blog, he does a public access TV thing. He's out there a lot. In this case, he asked the city for two things: records of bills submitted to the city by a law firm doing work for the city, and then a record of payment from the city to the law firm. So the corporation counsel, the attorney responsible for freedom of information in Hartford, says, I have your FOI request and will coordinate the response. Such documentation as is allowed or required by law will be provided. Now, when you get a request for records, if any of you on a board or commission do, I know that they come to the mayor, whoever you go to, or if you have to handle it yourself, always send out a letter like that in 4 business days. That doesn't necessarily mean to produce the records, but you always acknowledge in 4 days, because if you don't, the law says you've denied, and they can file one of those complaints that we talked about. So why am I reading you this? Because in the process of responding to this individual whom he does not like, the corporation counsel, the attorney for the city of Hartford, accidentally copied the requester on an email he had written to somebody else about how much he didn't like the guy. Now in the hands of the requester, a journalist, and I know we're being recorded, so I'll clean it up, but you'll get the idea, is the following. Carl, so who lit a fire under this? It's a bad word that starts with an A. If he's involved in litigation, ongoing, and or other projects that he hasn't asked about, can I shut him down? So his real response isn't, I'm going to look into it, it's, I don't like him, in rather vulgar terms. How do I get rid of him? So the guy takes this and runs with it. It's on his blog, it's on the public access TV thing, it's all over, and he's connected. It's on WFSB, it's on the Current the next morning. Hartford looks bad. So he tries to walk it back. Now, I don't know if you can see this. This is City of Hartford letterhead, right? He tries to write sort of a letter of apology, but he can't do it. In his letter of apology is the following. Apparently you have little else to do other than to pester me in this office and other city departments. Recall that I do not work for you. The purpose of the FOIA statute is not to provide you a playground. Hey guys, even if you think that, please don't write it. You've created another public record that goes to the law. It doesn't do any good. And so he takes another pounding in the media. And P.S., the part that's sort of the humorous part, but the part that's the worst is that because it was him and because he felt so strongly, he didn't even bother to look at what he was asking for. He gave him nothing. The next headline we see is Hartford loses before FOI commission. None of the records were exempt. He should have just given them out. Put aside any personal feelings you might have. Look at what the records are and then know some of these exemptions. Now again, this is where your staff comes in handy, where your knowledge of what to do before. Always think in terms of, okay, yes, it's a public record. Are we going to give it out, or is something fall that we're not going to give it out? And if you have questions, I want you to call us. As I said, Deb, Jill, the mayor, they know stuff about FOI. Ask them, and we'll give you a straight answer. You may not like it, but we'll tell you this is what we think you should do. Okay?
Let me address Tom's comment here. All currently, under this administration, all FOI requests go through the mayor's office, every one of them. And the reason I do that is because we have a procedure, policy, protocol that we follow, and we follow the same protocol for every FOI request. There have been in the past FOI requests that would go to the utility, and the same FOI request would go to the mayor's office, but the utility and the mayor's office weren't talking to each other. They were answering the same FOI request, but the individual got different information, and that's not pleasant. Okay, but that's not why I did it. Reason I did it was that I wanted we have a procedure, policy, protocol. I want one person to be there, because when I first got here, there were FOI requests all over the place, and I didn't know where they were. And they were in different stages. We had replied within the 4 days, we'll get back to you. And then some were 2 weeks old, some were 6 months old. And I'm like, we need to get our arms around the FOI. Because if you go back a couple years, we had a contentious couple things that were going on. So all FOI requests come out of the mayor's office or controlled out of the mayor's office. The mayor's office then reaches out to the department heads, IT, wherever they need to, in order to get the information to provide the FOI request. Another thing, and Tom may go into this now that I'm going to open the door, it's we've wrestled with this. We are not required to come to any conclusions or to produce anything. If we have it, you provide it, but I do not have to generate a database. I do not have to take this document and this document and create a new document. And that was learned painfully in the city of Groton. And so we are very precise about how we answer FOI requests. And it's not because I don't want to give the information. One of the big things that is very important to me is to be transparent. And that's one of the reasons people talk to me about, I tend to over-explain. And the reason I do that is, one, so that the council understands, or anybody that's in a meeting that I'm in, understands what we're doing and why we're doing it, but also, if it is publicized, I'm explaining to the general public what it is, why we're doing what we're doing, so that everybody understands it. And that is very important because the FOI thing is about not hiding things, because people in general are suspicious of government, and with the way things have been in the last few years or 10 years, whatever, there's an apathy and a mistrust of government. And so that's why the FOI is there, is to make sure that if somebody wants information, they get the information. Sorry, go ahead.
No, but to wrap up, remember the mayor just made a good point. You have obligations to get records to people in a reasonable amount of time when their records request, but you're not required to create anything. You're not required to do research, and you're not required to drop everything you're doing because someone says under FOI, I want a record. There's a reasonableness involved. Even if the request is large, you have a conversation, you try to get the person to perhaps narrow the scope. But if not, if they want a whole package, then you say, fine, but we're a small town, we're a small city, this is how long it's going to take. Be reasonable, be smart about it, and you'll be okay. Right. Just sort of go, those of you who are on boards, just go forth with that concept that everything's a public record.
Because sometimes what we will get is we'll get a request that looks like this. I want any and all records pertaining to this subject.
Right.
And then we have to call the individual, we send out the letter, but then we call them up and say, okay, when you talk about that subject, what does that mean? And any and all, what are you talking about? Are you talking about building records? Are you talking about utility records? Are you talking about finance records? Because this could be, I mean, I could give you a stack that weighs 100 pounds and at 50 cents a page, here's what it's gonna cost you. So sometimes because a lot of times the FOI requests, they're trying to get information, but they don't know how to word it to get the information.
But
So-
that's actually a part of when I do the longest talk, exactly what I tell people. Have a conversation. A lot of times people ask for all this because they don't know what they're asking for. You'd be surprised how often that works.
Right.
I'm mindful of the time, the fact you have another meeting. I have parting gifts. These are what I call the Freedom of Information American Express card. Don't leave home without them. It's highlights of the FOI Act. Very small print, but we're a very small agency. On the back, our phone number, our website can be very helpful. These cards can be great for a wallet, a purse, a desk drawer, on the fly. Feel free to take one, pass them around, keep the extras. And the other thing I bring with me when I talk, especially to boards and commissions, I call this the meeting cheat sheet. It's a grid. It tells you when meetings need to be noticed, what kind of meetings need to be noticed when minutes are due, things like that. These can also be helpful as well. So take them, feel free to copy them and share them with your fellow board members. Is there anything that I didn't touch on that you wanted to ask about, anybody? All right, now you know as soon as I walk out of here, you'll have a question. Please, the offer is sincere.
In the
Do you have
parking lot.
anything? In the parking lot. You can chase me down to habits. Anything that you have a question about, this law can be really confusing, especially if you're not legally trained. No question is stupid. Do not hesitate to pick up the phone and call, and we'll get you an answer, okay?
Well done.
Anything else?
Nope, that's it. Thank you,
Thank you
Tom.
all very, very much.
Okay, hold on, I still have business. There's no executive session, so therefore there's no comments from the executive session. So, Deb, since we had three in the beginning, can I just go ahead and adjourn? Or if Rashad's here, I can log him in and then we could do
You could say that he has
Okay, Councilor Carter is here, so I have a quorum. In that case, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
I make a motion to adjourn.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? All in favor? Well, actually, you don't have to vote on it. We're adjourned. So the meeting is adjourned. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you for what you do every day, because we depend on volunteers to make the city run.